It's 4:01 p.m. Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you. Happy New Year. And thank you for joining us as we start 2021 with the governance section of the ZICO ESG webinar series. My name is Wei Min, and I'll be your moderator for today. Right, before we begin, I would like to remind participants that you are welcome to submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer them. We have a lot of content today, so we will try to have a Q&A session at the end. But if not, please feel free to email us with your contact details, with your questions. And if you want a copy of our slides, we will also send them to you once you give us your contact details. Now, today's governance topic is the third and final installment of our ESG webinar series. Governance is a critical component of ESG and covers a broad range of topics, including board and management structures, shareholder rights, and compliance with law. Joining me, as you can see on the screen, are four senior and very seasoned corporate practitioners from ZICO Malaysia and ZICO Singapore, who will take us through the hard law and the soft law of corporate governance, lessons for SOEs from the SRC international case, and the most recent meat distribution scandal that highlight how critical proper governance is. I'm just going to do a quick introduction to the speakers today. Ang Siak Keng is a corporate partner based in our Penang office and has led numerous domestic and cross-border corporate transactions ranging from private M&As, public takeovers, IPOs, private equity for MNCs, leading domestic companies, and foreign investors to Malaysia, especially China SOEs. Yap Yan Seng is Managing Director of ZICO Singapore and is highly experienced in the capital markets and corporate practice in Singapore. His practice encompasses M&As, including schemes of arrangements, takeovers, and competitive sale processes, corporate finance, and restructuring. Yan Seng has also advised in many successful RTOs in Singapore. Ahmad Zulkarnain is a corporate partner based in our Kuala Lumpur office and has extensive experience in advising public listed and government-linked companies in Malaysia on a whole range of corporate and equity capital market transactions. Nadaraj Naraj, or Raj as we all fondly call him, is a competition and technology partner based in our Kuala Lumpur office who specializes on compliance matters including anti-corruption, competition law, and personal data protection. Without further ado, I will invite Ang to kick the ball rolling and remind us all on the hard law and soft law of corporate governance for Malaysia. Over to you, Ang.
Okay, thank you, Wei Min. A warm welcome to our guests and also fellow colleague today. Okay, let's start to talk about the hard law and the soft law of corporate governance. Yeah, as many of us are aware, ESG matters are now mainstream consideration across the global economy. Board should understand and incorporate this new dimension into your core decision-making process. However, the challenge is that there's yet to be a universally accepted definition of ESG indicators, and the definition will vary from company to company and from sector to sector. So how is governance regulated? It is regulated by hard law and soft law, as you are seeing in front of you. There are aspects of corporate governance where statutory regulation, or what we call hard law, is necessary, and others where self-regulation completed by market regulation, or what we call soft law, is more appropriate. Let us look at each of them. Okay. For hard law, in Malaysia, the #1 hard law on corporate governance is our Companies Act, which applies to all companies incorporated in Malaysia. CA 2016 contains various provisions relating to directors, management, meetings, shareholders' rights, shareholders' protections, etc., which are clearly regulated and have been supported by a library of court cases that serve to clarify the legal position for each legal point. Specific to corporate governance, Section 213 provides that a director shall exercise reasonable care, skill, and diligence. This means that proper risk management and internal control are important aspects of a company's governance, management, and operation. Risk management focuses on identifying threats and opportunities, while internal controls helps counter threats and takes advantage of opportunities. To satisfy the legal fiduciary duty of director nowadays, director will need to understand and consider ESG in decision making. Apart from normative provision that seek to influence behavior of board, officers, and employees of a company, there are other provisions in the Companies Act that regulate the extent of disclosure a company should make in connection with corporate governance. Take, for example, Section 253 of the Companies Act, which is then extended to the 5th schedule, talks about directors' report on contents of business. It talks about each director report may include a business review. The business review may, to the extent necessary for an understanding of the development, performance, or position of the company's business, contain information about environmentals, including the impact of business on the environment, social and community issues. Next slide, please. Another example of hard law that applies to public listed companies in Malaysia is the listing requirement. As you see in front of you, the listing requirement mandate the board of directors provide an overview on the application of the principles set out in the Malaysian Code of Corporate Governance, or MCCG, in its annual report, where the application of each practice set out in MCCG during the financial year to be disclosed to the exchange in the prescribed format, and announce the same together with the announcement of the annual report. We will talk about the broad principles of MCCG in a short while. Since 31st December 2016, there has been a requirement for the board to provide sustainability statement in the annual report to disclose to the shareholders the listed issuers management of material, economy, environment, and social risks and opportunities. I believe many of the attendees here are already practicing and very well aware of these sustainability statements. This is an example of hard law. Next slide, please. Another hard law is the SC Guidelines. Yeah, SC Guidelines actually has a force of law. Yeah, you will notice from the slide in front of you that other than exercising power of directors for proper purpose, starting from 1st January 2021, yeah, this year at this moment, the SC Guidelines requires that directors of PLC must ensure that a PLC has group-wide framework for cooperation and communication and corporate governance, including assessing non-financial performance of the group. This is in Chapter 5 of the SC Guideline. Yeah, in front of you is 5.01 to 5.03. This is something that kickstarts in January this year. Next slide, please. So now let us look at the soft law common in Malaysia. Basically, soft laws are non-binding and voluntary standards that a company can sign up to. One such good example is the UNPRI, or United Nations Principle for Responsible Investment, which identify factors broken down across each of the E, S, and G. For G, or governance, it focuses on, among others, board diversity and whistleblowing policies, and many other things. Signatories of the UNPRI commit to incorporate ESG factors into their investments. And among others, BlackRock, a famous asset management company, is a signatory. So they will take into consideration ESG factor when they invest or take up shares in a particular company. The other example of soft law is the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI standards. The GRI standards create a common language for organizations, large or small, private or public, to report on their sustainability impacts in a consistent and credible way. This enhances global comparability and enables organizations to be transparent and accountable. GRI covers many areas, including tax, where a company will have to disclose and discuss whether the company has tax strategy, the governance body within the company that formally reviews tax strategy, approach to regulatory compliance, and how the approach to tax is linked to the business and sustainable development strategies of the company. Now, the interesting question is how effective are these soft law? Yeah, Many are of the opinion that these non-legal drivers, namely investors' pressure, where investors are using ESG performance indicator to look beyond the bottom line financial performance to decide whether to invest, and changing consumers' attitude, where consumers are now buying products from companies which has high ESG score, explain that soft law are driving the focus of ESG. Yeah, much so than the hard law. Next slide, please. Okay, underlying this hard law and soft law, there are some common and globally acknowledged broad principles on corporate governance. And in Malaysia, we should look at the Malaysian Code of Corporate Governance 2017. So what is G or governance? According to MCCG, corporate governance is defined as a process and structure used to direct and manage the business and affairs of a company towards promoting business prosperity and corporate accountability with the ultimate objective of realizing long-term shareholders' value while taking into consideration the interests of other stakeholders. Here, the word is stakeholders and not just shareholders. So there are three principles spelled out in MCCG. Number one, board leadership and effectiveness. Two, effective audit and risk management. And three, integrity in corporate reporting and meaningful relationship with stakeholders. On board leadership and effectiveness, the expectation on directors have evolved significantly owing to change in the corporate landscape, and ESG is definitely one of the changes. Board is expected to set strategies, aim company values and standards. Independent directors should not completely delegate the responsibility of setting business strategy and plans to the EDs. There must be a demarcation of responsibility between the board and management, i.e. no one single person or group should control the board. Look at what happened in 1MDB. The board must have the right composition to ensure sufficient diversity and independence to avoid group thinking or blind spots in the decision-making process. The MCCG says that remuneration package should take into account the complexity of the company's business and the individual responsibility. On remuneration, one common question is whether senior management's remuneration be measured against the median salary of the company workforce. So is that the correct approach? Is it a sign of bad governance? The answer to this is to look back at the principle, i.e. the remuneration should take into account many factors such as a person's responsibilities and align it with the business strategy and long-term objective of the company. The third and final principle, the second principle actually, is effective audit and risk management. MCCG explained that risk management is about focusing on identifying threats and opportunities. Board must be provided with reasonable assurance that adverse impact arising from a foreseeable future events or situation on the company's objective is mitigated and managed. Look at Kodak. The board did not foresee the rise of digital photography. There was a failure to reinvent and late in reaction to disruption. The third principle is integrity in corporate reporting and meaningful relationship with stakeholders. The MCCG sees this as ongoing engagement and communication with stakeholders. Again, it goes beyond shareholders to build trust and understanding. It provides stakeholders a better appreciation of the company's objective and the quality of its management, which will in turn assist stakeholders on how their voting rights will be exercised. From the company's perspective, it provides invaluable feedback which can develop business strategy. This principle leads to the concept of integrated reporting with all detailed information such as governance, which hopefully will lead to value creation. A good lesson on this is the BP Deepwater Horizon case, where failure of this principle was seen. The financial report and sustainability report did not review core weakness in the company's management of pivotal issues of maintenance and safety. And the board also failed to address the PR issue well, which led to a long-term effect on the brand image of the company. Okay, with my quick introduction on the hard law and soft law and principle corporate governance, I hope this will dovetail nicely to what my colleague will share with you after me. Yeah, back to you, Wei Min.
Thank you, Ang. Very insightful and informative broad-based summary of the Malaysian position. let's now cross over to Singapore to Yen Sing, who will tell us about the governance laws and regulations over there. Over to you, Yen Sing.
Hi. Hi, this is Lian Sing. I'm the managing partner of Singapore Zico Insights Law. And I'm covering this subject on the Singapore aspects of the same topics that Ang has just covered. So in Singapore, the corporate governance rules, are slightly lighter, lesser in terms of numbers than the Malaysian position. It's mainly set out in the Companies Act, the Listing Manual, and the SFA. Between the three, the Listing Manual probably sets out the most extensive one. There's a soft law of which is where you can find the Code of Corporate Governance, the Singapore Code of Takeovers and Mergers, the GRI, which is always there, and then there's the company's constitutions. Next slide, please. Companies Act. The Companies Act sets out the basic provisions for the governance of Singapore of companies. In many instances, this Companies Act requirements are similar to Malaysia. The numbers are obviously different, but I will not go through this in detail because whatever you I went through just now, is very much similarly applicable to Singapore. Singapore also has the Articles of Association set out in the Companies Act. This is commonly adopted by a lot of private companies. As you know, the Companies Act articles are not like a shareholders agreement or joint venture agreement between parties. So it is still, if you want a closer governance, it is still good to have a shareholders agreement, which sets out, reserve matters. It sets out a lot of different things like I mentioned, the reserve matters, their preemption rights, drag along, pull along, and this type of provisions. So the Companies Act is limited in that sense. Can you move on? Here we have the SFA. SFA is primarily relating to the offer of securities in Singapore. There are some provisions in there that talks about disclosures. This is applicable to governance. The Singapore authorities do enforce this failure to disclose interest in quite serious manner. There have been several high-profile charges on company owners and directors who have failed to on a timely basis make their disclosures. So as a corporate lawyer, we do ask and require and advise the clients to watch this disclosures very, very carefully. Next. The Code of Corporate Governance is incorporated in the Listing Manual. The Listing Manual, this sets out the most extensive law, or rules, for governance in Singapore. In terms of the coverage, it is quite similar to the MCCG in Malaysia. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. All the listed companies in Singapore are required to follow the code, and they also need to explain and justify if they are not following the code in any material manner, in any aspects of it. Next. The Singapore Code of Takeovers, is a code that I'm quite very familiar with. There's a requirement for equality of information, in a takeover situation. I believe this is quite similar to other jurisdictions that adopt code to govern takeover situations. So you can see in here, there are several provisions to ensure that there's equality of treatment of minority shareholders in a takeover situation. Next. Company's constitution. I did mention briefly just now when we're talking about the Companies Act, about company's constitution and model constitution that's generally adopted. I have to say that this is actually becoming very, very common in Singapore. So I understand more than 98% of companies are usually incorporated on this basis. So it makes it quite easy to guess what the rules, okay, the articles that's applicable to any company for Singapore incorporated companies. Okay, next. Sustainability report. Okay, the listing manual in Singapore has a requirement now, okay, to have all issuers provide a sustainability report in their annual report. Okay, the sustainability report describes, okay, sustainability practices with the following primary components: material, environmental, social, and governance factors, policies, practices, and performance targets, sustainability reporting framework, the board statement. And if they exclude any primary components, they must disclose such exclusion and describe what it does instead. So in both the coverage and extent, okay, it's quite similar to the Malaysian requirement of sustainability report. Okay, so compliance is now compulsory. Okay, next. So we have the roadmap for the implementation of corporate governance, the planning stage, materiality assessment, target setting, data collection, and then assurance and reporting. So this is the steps that you need to go through in order for you to set out the disclosures, okay, appropriately. Next. Okay, GRI in Singapore, because for all the listed companies, you know that they are required under the SGX rules for the code of corporate governance. In a lot of instances, okay, it is very similar to what GRI framework sets out. So the GRI standards have been adopted by more than 90% of the Singapore listed issuers, okay, for this basis because of the similarity, okay, in terms of standards and requirements. So GRI is actually a good reference point, okay, for companies in Singapore when they do their disclosures. Okay, next. In Singapore, we do have a governance and transparency index. This is commonly published, okay, and reported by the newspapers. There are studies which shows that companies which score well, okay, in the index have a better following and that's reflected in a better valuation in terms of the PE and in terms of trading volumes for listed companies. So it has shown that there's a higher level of correlations, okay, between a higher index point, okay, in terms of this governance and disclosures, as with the valuation aspects of companies. Next. Okay, MES incentives. Okay, this slide is more about sustainability. Singapore government has various schemes, okay, that promotes green and what we call sustainable energy investments. So we set out here, okay, the bond grant schemes, okay, and the green investment schemes and the GSLL, the green and sustainability loan grant schemes, okay, which supports various types of sustainable energy investments. Okay, thanks. Okay, I think I'm done. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Lansing. That's the Singapore perspective. It is all for listed companies and non-listed companies, all about transparency, disclosure, reporting requirements today, all more important than ever. Now we have a slightly different twist to the hard law and soft law that we talked about with Ahmad, who will talk to us about corporate governance for SOEs in Malaysia, largely arising from what we can see from the SRC international case. Ahmad, over to you.
Thank you, Wei Min. The term SOEs, if I can start with that, is rarely used in Malaysia. Instead, we are more familiar with the term GLC or GLCs, which are basically SOEs in essence. Moving on to the next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, in Malaysia, we have 7 GLCs. If you can see on the slide, we have MOF, we have Khazanah, we have PNB, we have COP, EPF, Tabung Haji, and lastly, LTAT. You can look at the next slide. Some of these GLCs have their own peculiar corporate governance standards based on their constitutive law, as you can see on the screen. Next slide, please. In addition to the 7 GLCs that I've just mentioned, we have more than 30 PLCs, public listed companies, which are controlled or substantially owned by the GLCs. These are also known as GLCs. For example, we have Maybank, TNB, Telecom, Axiata, CIMB, Simdabi, Sunrise, Petronas Chemicals, Petronas Gas, Petronas Gangan, the list goes on. Based on the report in 2013, they comprise about 42% of the total market capitalization of all companies listed on Bursa. Now, because of the sheer size of control that SOEs has in corporate Malaysia, actions of SOEs will have significant impact to the Malaysian economy. Now, according to the OECD Guidelines on corporate governance of SOEs, if you can move on to the next slide, good corporate governance of SOEs is critical to ensure their positive contribution to the economic efficiency and competitiveness. Now, when you see, if there is a lapse of corporate governance of SOEs, naturally, there will be significant impact to the country. Lapses in corporate governance in one MDB, for example, has cost billions. I'm not talking about millions, we're talking about billions of ringgit lost to the country. Not to mention that it was also said to be among the main factors that brought the downfall of a dynasty. So, do we have issues with the corporate governance standards of our SOEs? The answer is most probably. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any scandals involving certain SOEs in our country, right? So what do we do? How do we improve? Now, please move on to the next slide. I'd like to refer to the OECD guidelines again. The OECD guidelines propounds the principle that the board of SOEs should have the necessary authority, competency, and objectivity to carry out their functions of strategic guidance and monitoring of management. Now, to implement this, according to OECD, the power to appoint CEO should rest with the board, not with the top or supreme leader of a country. The guidelines also recommends that the board composition should allow the exercise of objective and independent judgment. Lastly, the board members should be nominated based on their qualification, not based on their political affiliation. Yeah. So where are we in view of this expectation under the OECD guidelines? This is what certain commentators said. If you can move on to the next slide, please. One Saiful, who was the CEO of Ideas, said, and I quote, "There is a real issue here with regards to the corporate governance of our SOEs because today too much power is concentrated in one hand." He also said, "We need to look at improving the system." Now, I can't agree more to what he said. We have seen this happen in the SRC international case. In this case, the learned Justice Nazlan, he said, "In the corporate governance structure of SRC, the true control and ultimate power vested in the accused and no other. The law would therefore consider the accused to have been entrusted with full dominion over SRC, including its property, even from its establishment." Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is despite the fact that SRC International having a fully functioning board. So what went wrong? But more importantly, what we can do to correct the wrong or to avoid the wrongness. Moving on to the next slide. I think the quickest solution is to bring all the perpetrators to justice. At the moment, we have one ex-prime minister who had been convicted, and many more cases are still pending in the court. However, I think we need to consider the long-term solutions to the problem at hand. There are a number of strategies which I think can be categorized into two. The first one is political solutions, and the second one is non-political solutions. Now, what do I mean by political solutions? These are the three examples or options, solutions that can be adopted, can be considered as part of the political solutions to address the problems that we have with our SOEs at the moment. Political solutions are solutions that will require political involvement from government or our legislature. But on the other hand, non-political solutions can be adopted when there is insufficient push or motivation or support from the political front. Now, when I talk about political solutions, these are the three solutions that I can think of. The first one is governmental intervention. Second is statutory control. And the third one, lastly, regulatory reform. Coming back to governmental intervention, moving on to the next slide, please. We have seen this effectively and drastically done immediately after Tun M seized power from Datuk Seri Najib Razak after the PH coalition won in the GE14 in 2018. Among the first steps that Tun M took was to form this sort of Jedi Council, named the Council of Eminent Persons, comprising 5 eminent members tasked with advising the fledgling government on how to deal with the nation's most pressing problems within the first 100 days. Now, as a result, we saw a number of drastic changes in Malaysia's corporate landscape. Take Tabung Haji case, for example. Before GE14, there were 4 politicians, including the chairman, sitting on the board of Tabung Haji. Immediately after GE14, we had 0 politicians on the board. And I think that is good, because then the board will be able to make a decision without any influence from the political masters. Moving on to the next slide. Now we talk about statutory control. What do I mean by that? What I mean by this is the control that through the statutes. For example, we can look at, in the case of SOCSO, the constitutive law is the Employees Social Security Act 1969. In this act, it contains a provision that disqualifies a member of legislature to be a member of the board. So because of this, none of the MPs or the member of State Legislative Assembly would be able to be sitting on the board of SOCSO. Another example is in the case of CMSA, or Capital Market and Services Act 2007, where the law requires the appointment of public interest directors on the board of the stock exchanges, whose appointment, although made by the Minister of Finance, by consultation with the Securities Commission is required, where the SC would then assess the integrity, fitness, and properness of the candidate. This, I think, will serve as a check and balance in the appointment process, which is good and which is healthy. But however, this is not the case for Tabung Haji and Felda. If you can flip to the next slide. Yeah. So this is where I think regulatory reform should be considered, right? Because certain laws governing certain SOEs in Malaysia, to me personally, I think are insufficient in many aspects. If you look at the Tabung Haji Act 1995, this is the law that governs Tabung Haji. The law says the board will comprise the appointees of the minister in charge of religious affairs, in addition to 2 other members being representatives from the PM's department and the treasury respectively. So there is no statutory check and balance in the appointment process. The case is the same in Felda, where everyone is appointed by the minister and the chairman himself is the minister. Now, I'm not saying that this is essentially bad. On the other hand, this statutory strategy of giving the full discretion to the minister is good, because it gives the greatest flexibility as regards to the appointment of board members, which can ensure efficient administration. But on the other hand, when you give too much power to people, problems may ensue, as they say. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Perhaps a better approach can be seen in the case of Johor Corporation, where although certain appointments are made by the Sultan, if you can see in the law as projected there, there is certain specific requirements for the appointees to be having experience in relevant areas, including banking, manufacturing, housing, commerce, and finance. So this provision, ladies and gentlemen, I think is essential to ensure that the board comprises qualified persons. We have also seen similar requirements in the case of EPF and Co-op based on their constitutive documents, if you can see on this slide. In the case of EPF, for example, Section 4 of the Employees Provident Fund Act 1991, it says not more than 5 persons who shall have knowledge or experience in finance, business, economy, social security, or other relevant knowledge or experience. But if you look at the case of LTAT, there is no mention about qualification of the board members. We can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so if we were to reform all or some of these statutory provisions, what can be the benchmark to emulate or adopt? I think it depends on the nature of the organization. For example, Tabung Haji. It is principally engaged in collecting deposit from depositors, much like a bank. So, how the banks in Malaysia are governed? If you can move on to the next slide. Banks in Malaysia are governed by FSA or IFSA, depending on whether it's conventional or Islamic. The law requires B&M's approval to be obtained prior to the appointment of any director. In addition, the candidate must fulfill the fitness and properness requirements. So if you compare the requirements in Tabung Haji Act on the one hand and the FSA and IFSA on the other hand, you can see the differences are huge. There had been a number of scandals involving Tabung Haji, if you can see, you can read from the news, which were unearthed after the G14. And these scandals could perhaps be avoided if the corporate governance standards in Tabung Haji were at a level which was comparable to a bank. History had shown prior to the enhancement of regulatory regime for banks in Malaysia, there were a number of major scandals involving banks in Malaysia. For example, in 1980s, we have Bank Boom Trust scandal, and in 1995, we had Perwira Habib Bank scandal. So many scandals in the early 1980s until in 1989, we had BAFIA that had enhanced the regulatory regime, the requirements, or the corporate governance standards of all banks in Malaysia. And since then, we have never heard of any major scandals involving banks in Malaysia. So this, ladies and gentlemen, proves the effectiveness of banks regulation in Malaysia, which SOEs may, where appropriate, emulate. Now, enough about political solutions. What about non-political solutions? If you can move on to the next slide. Next one. Yes. Non-political solutions. So basically, it's the 5R strategy that you can see on the slide. I'm talking about restructure, rethink, record, report, and lastly, resign. So let's go through this one by one. Restructure, what do I mean by that? This, ladies and gentlemen, will require corporate leaders to assess its corporate governance structure to ensure that it complies with certain standards. Now, let's look at the 1MDB case. Typically, governance structure will look like a pyramid. We have the management, and on top of the management, we have the board, right? But in 1MDB case, on top of the board, we have the star being the prime minister. It looks like a Christmas tree. Now, it is probably a bad idea to put that star on top of the tree if you know what I mean. Yeah. So please look at your structure. When the case requires it, restructure it. And when you're not sure, maybe you can give me a call. I can assist. Right. Moving on to the next slide. Rethink. What do I mean by that? This will require you to change your mindset and appreciate what is happening around you. Now, contrary to the popular belief, laws are not carved in stone, so to speak. Apart from the 10 commandments during the Moses time, laws are constantly changing. The corporate governance standards are increasing year by year. So keeping up with the development should come naturally. The third one is record. Yeah, but this is more about disclosure. Disclosure enhances accountability, and accountability puts people on their toes. Much has been said about the importance of sufficient disclosure, and I don't plan to repeat this now. Next one is report. Yeah, report is very, very important. Without brave people reporting or whistleblowing wrongdoings, the wrongdoers will continue with their wrongdoings, and the wrongdoings will breed more wrongdoings until they become pandemic. Now, how do we stop a pandemic? We isolate these wrongdoers so that they don't infect other people, so to speak. Right? So do you stop a pandemic by declaring a state of emergency? I leave this question to you to answer. Lastly, resign. This is interesting. Sometimes the battle between the small voice in the board and the powers that be is not a battle between David and Goliath, where David can win against the giant. It is, to me, a battle between a cucumber on the one hand and a durian on the other hand, where the small voice is the cucumber. You will find that avoiding the battle is the best thing to do. When you are the cucumber, you will never win. Right? So you have the option of either resign and live happily ever after, or continue with the battle and suffer the fate of being squished into juice. So resigning silently puts pressure to the power that be. So that concludes my talk about the governance standards of SOEs in Malaysia. Back to you, Wei Min. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmad. I would just like to tell everyone that these 5 R's is copyright by Ahmad. It comes from him. It's his solutions. If you want to know more about it, please contact him. We thought that it would be useful to end this section on SOEs by talking a little bit about the a recent issue that affects the two countries. This is about the termination of the Kuala Lumpur Singapore high-speed rail project, which peoples of both countries are very concerned about, and you know, like all of us here, we have really hoped to happen. There have been reports about reasons from both sides about the reasons for the termination. And for here, we'll just ask Lian Xing to share a little bit about his insights on what he thinks on this topic. Lian Xing?
Okay. First of all, I have to say that I'm particularly affected by this because, you know, for Zico, the main office is in KL, and I was looking forward to be able to hop on the train, okay, and be in KL for lunch and come back back home for dinner. But obviously, right now it seems like that's not going to happen anytime soon. So anyway, in Singapore, there was clearly obviously reports about why this project was terminated. One of the reasons that was given, okay, because this is mainly for those who are not based in Singapore and do not read the news here, is that the COVID economy, okay, the impact on COVID on the economy has been affected, and that this is beyond the affordability of Malaysia. I don't know, maybe it's not Malaysia, but affected affordability for this project. In Singapore, in Parliament, okay, the Transport Minister also mentioned that Malaysia's proposal to remove the asset company from the HSR, okay, is a major issue to the Singapore side. For those who knows a bit of detail about this project company, basically the asset company is the one that owns the rail stock and the trains, okay, in this. So even though this is a joint project, or rather most of the aspects of this rail is in Malaysia. There's supposed to be joint ownership of this, and I think Singapore said that the Transport Minister in Singapore said that that's part of the reason why it was not acceptable when it was proposed to remove. Anyway, we are just mentioning this just to give an example to show that when there's a cooperation between two parties, okay, a common standard for governance is necessary. If both sides cannot agree, okay, or let's just say in a joint venture situation, okay, even if both are in the same country, then it's very difficult for a project to be successful. Okay. Wei Min?
Okay, thank you. I think both governments of both countries have reiterated the commitment to good relations amongst us, and we're all open to future connectivity. So I think everyone remains hopeful on this topic. Finally, we have Raj to talk and tell us about the meat distribution scandal that happened recently, and the expectation of anti-corruption government action in Malaysia for 2021.
Thank you, Wei Min. Hi everybody. In preparation for this webinar, Wei Min told me, Raj, don't talk too long and don't talk nonsense. So I'm going to follow these two mantras as I go along. Okay, so when we talk about governance, one of the important verticals is always anti-corruption. Now, why do we keep coming back to anti-corruption? You know, it's the same old thing. Why anti-corruption again and again? Well, firstly, if you look at the 2019 Royal Bank of Canada survey, institutional investors considered anti-corruption as one of the top ESG concerns when making investments into companies. Okay. Secondly, the enforcement blitz by the MACC did not sleep even though there was a COVID pandemic. So the two recent cases, if you were following Malaysian news, was number one, the immigration scandal, where there was immigration officers that was involved in a syndicate that was transporting people in and out of the country. They uncovered that. Secondly, the hot one is the Malaysian meat cartel. Now, next slide, please. Okay, so this meat cartel case is actually very new. It was uncovered only in November, but it threatens to implicate a lot of companies, a lot of high-ranking officers of government, and also several tycoons. Okay, what is this case about? It's actually quite simple. What happened was there was a syndicate, or there is a syndicate actually, that's importing meat from various countries, repackaging them in Malaysia as halal meat and distributing it downstream to sellers and buyers. Now, it starts from the port and it goes down to distribution centers, immigration officers, customs, and also various import and export companies. Now, what we've learned, what I have learned actually, speaking to some clients and also from media reports, is that the MACC is not just actively investigating the suspects, the syndicate itself, but they are learning that there are various other companies who are involved in assisting this syndicate. Next slide, please. So what they've realized, and what is reported in the news thus far, is that this syndicate has been using proxy companies for their operations. Actually, there's a funny story behind this. One old uncle in a rural kampung area in Malaysia was actually called up by MACC. And he's like, why am I being investigated? So he said, oh, you were named as one of the directors of these proxy companies. And this man only has a bicycle or a motorcycle as his asset. And he says, I know nothing about this. And after investigation, they realized actually that this syndicate has been using Bumiputra names, falsifying them and putting them as directors of company. So the net is going to be cast out very wide in this investigation. Syndicate companies offered bribes to government officers, including money, gifts, sex, to enable the cartel to operate. Now, these bribes were not given by the syndicate companies directly because they're very smart. They use a lot of conduits to bribe these officers. MACC thus far, in the span of 2-3 months, has already seized tons of documents. 4 individuals have been detained for further investigation, including company directors. And linking back to what Ahmad was talking about, MACC is not ruling out the involvement of reputable companies and tycoons in this investigation. Now, what does all this mean? It means that your company, or even companies linked to your organization, could be involved in this investigation. May not be as suspects, but to facilitate the investigation. This is where the governance issue comes into play. Next slide. Now, as you know, in Malaysia, there is a corporate liability provision in our anti-corruption laws. And this is similar to the UK Bribery Act and also some other anti-corruption legislation in the world. What is this corporate liability provision all about? Now, if a person that is associated with a commercial organization commits a corruption offense, the commercial organization is deemed liable. So will the directors and senior management members of the company. They are deemed liable. I've repeated the word deemed. Why? Because knowledge and intention is irrelevant when implicating the company or the senior management members. If the associated person has done this corrupt act for the benefit of the company or for its business, these 2 categories of persons will be liable. And look at the penalties, it's severe, it's huge. Next slide, please. Now, there is no defense similar to other offense. Like for example, you can't say I had no intention or I had no knowledge. The only defense that the law provides is what we call as a reverse burden defense. Once the deeming provision kicks in, the commercial organization must prove that it has taken adequate measures to prevent the act. That is why we call it as a governance issue, because it is that you must implement adequate measures to prevent such acts from happening in the ecosystem of the company. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know the what's about anti-corruption, right? Don't bribe. We know the why, because you can go to jail, simple as that. We know the who should be in charge of looking after anti-corruption compliance in the company, the board, because they are the directing will and mind of the company. But governance is about the how. How do we implement an effective anti-corruption compliance program to ensure that the company is not implicated or there is a defense for the company if the company is implicated? Next slide, please. Okay, the Prime Minister's Office has issued what we call as the GAP guidelines, or the Adequate Procedures Guidelines. It's a very high level, not very prescriptive, but high level concept type guidelines, which says that you have to implement these 5 trust policies. Let me go through this in more detail. Next slide, please. Okay, what do you want to do when you start off to implement adequate measures in the company? The first point is take into account the prisoner's dilemma. Now, you don't want to be the only company that is complying to the highest standards. I know this is counterintuitive, and you won't hear this from lawyers, right? You don't want to be the one that is taking the highest compliance standards. You want to ensure that your standards is industry-wide accepted. And you can get together as an industry to set standards on compliance. Why? Because look, let's be practical. This is the pandemic season and everybody is cash strapped. Cost is an issue. If you're GC and you're going to the board to invest a lot of money into just governance, the board is going to be asking you a lot of questions. So you want to take a practical approach. You want to take an industry acceptable approach. Okay. Number two, always start off with risk assessment. You can't take high standard compliance for all the business divisions within the company. Again, it's not practical. So what you want to do is to carry out a risk assessment within the company to see which are the business unit that poses the highest risk. Use a heat map, if you can see the slide there. Perhaps your government liaison department has the highest risk. Mark them as red. Finance department could be amber. They are gatekeepers because they approve payments. So they are amber risk. And human resources perhaps do not pose high risk when it comes to anti-corruption. So you can use this to put in different compliance standards for different divisions within the company. Policies and controls, point number 3. It is nice to have all these very beautiful policies. For example, look, we see a lot of no-give policies in companies. You don't want to have a policy because it just looks nice. Is a no-give policy really practical for the company? Perhaps not, because your company actually gives gifts to a lot of its customers or stakeholders. Now, giving gifts or corporate hospitality incentives may not be corruption if you follow the rules, right? So you may want to have thresholds instead of having a no-gift policy, okay? Train your, in point number B, train your finance department to be the gatekeepers. Ahmad mentioned to you about 1MDB. How many payments were made without going through checks? And finance departments are the ones must be trained to smell when something is bad, to be the first detector. To say, look, why are we paying a shell company? Why are we paying this much of money to a company that's not gone through any due diligence selection? Finance department should be the gatekeepers. Again, sorry, Ahmad, I'm copying a lot of what you are saying. Whistleblowers channel, a critical point. Having all the safeguards, but not having a channel for employees to report is useless, right? Because you need people to report. And a whistleblowing channel is critical in every governance structure. Next slide, please. Okay, screening your agents and contractors. I've heard clients come up to me and say, look, how can we screen our agents or those who work for us? Because there's no database in Malaysia for you to do so. The answer to that is yes and no, because the MACC actually has got a search database where you can actually search individuals who have been convicted of anti-corruption offense. And that's on their website. So you can actually go and screen to see who you're working with, whether they have been implicated in corruption offenses. Board oversight is point number 5. Every corruption compliance must be top-down, meaning you can't just park compliance in one small department within the company, lock it up and hope you never see that person again, right? It's not like that. You have to park it with the board. The board has to revisit anti-corruption matters in at least every other board meeting to be up to speed in terms of what the company is implementing and whether there's any failures and what are the remedial measures to be taken. And lastly, awareness. Awareness doesn't mean having a boring anti-corruption 45-minute session for employees who will be sleeping at the back and not listening. It can be a test during performance appraisal. It can be a workshop. You can throw in some of the cases that we've mentioned, the meat cartel case, for the employees to discuss to see what went wrong, how would they have reacted if this came to their knowledge, and that could be things that you could put in the employee appraisal. Okay, I know time is cutting short. Let me go through the next few slides very quickly. Okay, if you need guidance, of course, I would promote come to Zaid Ibrahim and Co. We'll give you a lot of tips. But if you don't want to spend too much of money, there are references out there. The UK Serious Fraud Office, which is equivalent to the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, has published some of those guidelines that they deem to be acceptable. For example, hospitality expenditure. Now, I won't go through the scenario, but look at the recommendation. What they say is you can give hospitality and gifts, but you need to carry out a risk assessment on who you're giving it out to. Expenditure must not be over limit. It must be within acceptable means. Next slide, please. Due diligence of agents. Well, how do you check your agents or those working for the company, whether or not they're high risk? You can carry out a check whether they are public officials or whether they're owned by public officials, and also have a system to show that this could raise red flags when it comes to selection of agents. Next slide. Okay, actually, that's that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raj. You talked a little bit a lot about 17A NACC last year. It's good to start this year with a recap and reminder to everybody about it. The topic for today's session is about governance. We have some questions, but because time is running short and we've got the last bit to give to you, we will respond to those questions on email to you, not to worry. I will ask Ang now to give us a wrap-up, a quick summary wrap-up of what we recommend to you for boosting your governance score. Ang?
Okay, thank you, Wei Min. All right. To help you boost your governance score, there are a few important steps. Number one, you must detect and avoid risks. Number two, you must formulate strategy, always balancing legal risks with other corporate risks. Number three, predict opportunities. And number four, if something happens, how do you resolve it at the earliest opportunity? And number five, how to mitigate the risk. In the context of what I've just mentioned, we can help you to conduct due diligence, where we can conduct scenario planning and identify vulnerabilities, formulate strategies, consider the core drivers that deliver both value and sustainability. We help you to implement by rolling out plans in stages and track progress to refine business model. Next slide, please. Oh, no. Okay, yeah. After due diligence, we can help you to put all the findings together, strategy, mitigation, into three actionable and articulated parts, namely compliance, disclosure, and monitoring. For compliance, we can help with board charter, anti-bribery and corruption policies. Raj has said about implementing adequate procedures. That's what we can do. For disclosure, we can help with corporate governance report, sustainability report. And for monitoring, we can help with designing the role and term of reference of board committee and compliance office. As for SOE, next slide, please. Thanks to Ahmad, we have very good proposal as well. As for the SOE, we recommend a two-pronged approach to enhance the corporate governance standards of SOE via one, political solution, mainly through regulatory reform, which our firm has vast experience in drafting numbers of legislation in the past, and two, non-political resolutions through a 5R strategy, which is restructure, rethink, record, and lastly, resign. As your advisors, we always take a practical approach to compliance, i.e. it has to be risk-based, it has to be proportionate. Identify the business streams with the highest risk and pay focus to this. Adopt a top-down approach where the board spearheads and oversees all compliance activities. Okay, with that, we have come to the end of presentation and sharing today. I'll pass the session back to Wei Min.
Thank you, Ang. This brings us to the end of today's topic. I hope you have found it useful and enjoyable. Please feel free to reach out to us with your contact details if you want a copy of the slides, or we will respond to those who have come back to us with questions. Thank you very much to all the speakers and to all of you who have taken the time to tune in. Everybody have a good evening ahead. Thank you.